Welcome to the Faith and Works podcast. It's sponsored by the InterFaith Leadership Council of Metropolitan Detroit. The InterFaith Leadership Council is a faith-based civic organization that works to apply the highest and best shared values from our traditions to our community lives in order to create a thriving society. I am Bob Bruttell, and I am an adjunct professor of religious studies and history at the University of Detroit Mercy. I am also on the leadership team for the Interfaith Leadership Council of Metropolitan Detroit. We call it the IFLC. I will be your host and moderator for today's podcast. Today, we will begin a series of 2 or 3 podcasts exploring what our faith traditions say about caring for others and how we are to treat others. At this unsettling moment, what does that mean for us both individually and as a community? We want to know what difference it would make for society if we are faithful. Today, we will start with a grounding in the Hebrew Testament, the Christian New Testament, and the Sikh Guru Granth Sahib scriptures. Our title asks this question: care for others, charity or commandment? Today's distinguished panelists are Rabbi Joe Klein is Rabbi Emeritus at Temple Emmanuel in Oak Park, currently an adjunct professor at Rochester Christian University and Oakland University, teaching courses in Hebrew Scripture and Jewish Studies. Dr. Todd Hibbard is professor and chair of the Department of Religious Studies. J. Todd Hibbard teaches courses in the area of biblical studies, including both Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and New Testament, as well as method and theory in the study of religion. In addition, his courses regularly examine religious texts and practices from the ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman worlds. And Raman Singh. Raman is an observant Sikh. She is a member of the Mata Tripta Ji Gurdwara in Plymouth, Michigan, and she is a trustee on the board of trustees for the Gurdwara. I have known Raman for a long time and actually know her father, who was a part of the initial board members for the Interfaith Leadership Council of Metropolitan Detroit. So I know that she is steeped in that faith. And unlike our other 2 panelists, the Sikh faith doesn't have the kinds of teachers that are available in our universities as readily as the 2 of you are, that is, Joe and Todd. But I know how well she is steeped in her religious faith and often gives me ideas that are very are contrasting in ways from the faith that I profess as a cradle Catholic. And so I'm actually going to start with Raman and ask her if she would just reply to that kind of question. How is it, as she travels in these groups where there are often a predominance of Christians and then secondarily, a great number of Jewish folks who participate in it. She probably thinks often they think differently than I do, even though we come to some generally similar actions. And so I'd like to have you start with that. What are the contrasts that you think about this subject when we talk about care for others and the idea whether or not this is some sort of a suggestion or a commandment?
It's a great topic, I think, because care for others or care for those in need is central to the Sikh faith. But I kind of want to unwind the words a little bit, and maybe we can look into why they're so important. Like, why do we need to care for anybody else? Like, why does that even matter? What does that do for us, right? So if we say care for others, I think the first question is, what does care mean? So is care serving? Is care providing things they need? Is care elevating them? Is care providing comfort, empathy, sympathy, right? and who are others, right? So I think if I go back to the very root of Sikh faith and Sikhi itself, and we go to the Guru Granth Sahib, which is the scripture of the Sikhs, the very first word that drives all of Sikh theology and Sikh faith is Ik Onkar. The word Ik Onkar means one, and it's beyond that. It's the one creative force that is being and becoming, that is the sound that created the universe. And what is reminded to us, because we say that prayer every morning, we start our morning prayers with that word, right? And we usually end the day with it as well, is that there is no separate divine or God or power or whatever word you want to use. There is only the one, right? It is only so we are individuated, like we are separate human beings and creatures, and creation is all separated, but the oneness pervades all of that. And it's only like kind of this delusional ego we have that has solidified that separateness for us, that I'm separate from you and that I'm separate from the divine. That really what's going on is we're all the divine, and we're all just sort of in a play playing different roles. I'm playing Raman in this particular lifetime that I have for whatever number of years I'll be here, and then but the divine will persist and pervade, and the divine is forever and always was and always will be. So there really is no other. So the first challenge we have as Sikhs is to recognize the oneness, right? Because that will change your perspective, that I'm not really doing charity to anybody else, or I'm removing this falsehood that there is separation. So oneness is the ultimate truth, right? But how does that manifest in real life? Because I still have to be a human being. I still have to live in the world. I still have a family. I still have work. I have all of these things. And I still will encounter people or others that have much less than me or are in need in some way. So what we've sort of kind of taken that as far as practice goes, because philosophy doesn't mean anything unless it's practiced, unless you actually live it. So how do we live that? So the two central kind of practices that we're asked to do are Simran and Seva. Simran is the remembrance of the divine, which is just to remind yourself at all times that the divine is here and is there. So you are to keep that in your mind at all times and be in harmony with everything that's going on. So part of remembering the divine is remembering that everything the divine does is perfect. So even things that look upsetting or hurtful or problematic to us are still creations of the divine. However, we may have a role in ameliorating some pain or suffering that we have, whatever is within our power. And that's where the seva part comes in. So that's the other side of that. So seva is service. And it's service to anybody or anything that needs it, right? So we try to live that out because, again, the only way to serve the divine is to serve the divine's creation, right? We don't have the ability to, to do anything beyond that, right? So the only way to serve the divine is to help or do or care or provide something in some way. So Sikhs often live that out in their community meal called langar, but we also are supposed to live that out in our everyday life. So I think that's probably, if you want to talk about a contrasting type of idea, that's going to be the first one, is the idea that there really is no other, right? Because charity and seva can be a dangerous thing. They can increase our ego, right? Because really, who are you to serve anybody, right? Not that you didn't create anything. And if you have the opportunity to do something for anybody, that was provided to you by the divine. You're just lucky to be in that particular position. So you ought to be grateful for the opportunity to do something for somebody, as opposed to thinking, oh, look at me. I get points or something with somebody for giving a little, like from just the edges of my life, right? If I give money or if I give time, it's really just in the periphery, right? I'm keeping the core of it for my own selfish purposes at all time. And that's kind of the thing I have to break down. So I think I've talked a lot, so I'll let it go.
Wow. No, what a good start. So we we had a discussion before we started recording the podcast about what the title ought to be. And we batted around a few ideas and decided that we would start with the idea care for the other. And yet you are saying that even that, in a sense, is problematic because there is no other. So, Joe and Todd, what would you react to that? Which one would like to go first? Joe, how about you?
Sure. I remember hearing a story a long time ago that the student asks his teacher, "Where is God?" And the answer is, there is no place where is God not? Where is God not? In Jewish tradition, God is beyond anything that we can understand, appreciate, know, beyond all of that. To say that God is infinite means the essence of God is beyond my finite mind. So all I have is what exists in my finite world. So whatever I do in my finite world potentially is a part of what my obligation is and responsibility to God. So in Jewish tradition, this notion of covenant, Judaism is a covenant religion. So what is my role? What is my responsibility in that covenant? And the Jewish tradition always has said, my responsibility is to make this world a better place. There is an expression that comes out of mysticism of tikkun olam, repair of the world. So my responsibility every day is to make the world a little bit better. And to the extent that I can do that, even in the smallest bit, I am fulfilling my responsibility to God, fulfilling that responsibility. So I hear that hand in hand with what Raman was saying.
Yeah, I would echo that as well. And as I was listening to you talk, Raman, one of the things that it reminded me is that when we think about care for the other, there is a sense in which care for the other, it becomes a kind of care for the self. And I mean that in the best possible sense. Because if we see ourselves as interconnected with everyone and everything, then with no sharp demarcation between me and the other, then recognizing the need to care for others is a way of in the of capturing the highest ideals of making oneself what one should be. So I hesitate to call it a kind of virtue ethic, but it sort of puts me in mind of something like that, a kind of Aristotelian virtue ethic that when we're caring for the world, when we're caring for family, when we're caring for others, we're pursuing a kind of life that helps us actualize the highest ideals of what it means to be a human being in the world.
I think what we're saying also is that otherness is merely an artificial construct.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And once one recognizes that it's an artificial construct, it no longer carries any real meaning.
Mm-hmm. And is in some senses a very modern construct, right? I mean, I don't want to overplay the role of kind of Enlightenment thought, if we can think of it in those terms. But, there is this sense coming from, Descartes on down in the modern world, particularly in the West, that there is this sharp demarcation between me and you. And what strikes me as somebody who spends most of his working time in the ancient world is how foreign that really is to the way many throughout human history have thought about things. That this kind of sharp delineation and demarcation between me and you, in a kind of ontological sense, is really not something that we see until relatively recently in human thought.
And wasn't that at the very heart of Jesus's ministry to begin with?
Right. Right.
So I think that there are versions of Christianity that make a distinction between individual responsibility and social responsibility. I'm proposing that idea to ask whether or not you are saying, all three of you, that this idea is a misunderstanding of religious tradition in general, that you could separate something from, the personal responsibility from the social responsibility. Todd, would you find my demarcation as being true in some sense, that there seems to be an emphasis among some Christian sects that understand personal responsibility as it would emphasize that more than they would consider social responsibility?
Oh, I think very much so. So I think if you think about, just to take American Christianity for a moment, if you think about fundamentalist Protestant Christianity, for example, I think many, let's say prior to the 1970s, many people who would have associated with that would have thought that their primary responsibility was a kind of moral responsibility to God. That's the way they would have thought about it. But they wouldn't have necessarily thought that they had any need to care for the world. In fact, they they saw their lives as a kind of temporary moment on the way to leaving this world. And therefore, if you think you're only here temporarily, what's the point of really spending time investing in that? Wouldn't one be better off perfecting one's own, to use the Christian term, one's own sanctification, one's own kind of moral self as preparation for eternity? That's the way they would have thought about it. Then there's another stream of the Christian tradition that thinks about the sanctification of the self as becoming possible in part through one's commitment to care for the world. So sort of just the opposite. So they think about the same, sort of the same language and the same outcome, but the way one achieves that within those two different versions of American Christianity. And I'm sketching very broadly, right? That should be said. The way one achieves that is quite different. I can remember, if I could be autobiographical here for a moment, when I was a small child, we, for a while, lived in southeastern Kentucky in Appalachia. And we were not well off. We were, in fact, you would call us today lower middle class. We were poor where we were. And I can remember looking back on that thinking, well, there was not a whole lot of thinking about taking care of the world, but one of the reasons that didn't happen is because we were the ones in need of being taken care of. And so it was hard to think about taking care of the world when you were the ones who didn't need. So I think I said that to say that I think where you fall on that spectrum also shapes the way you think about what that moral obligation looks like. And so it can look very different depending on your own positionality, to use the word. Your own place in the world determines what that looks like for you. So the moral commitment, the ethical commitment can be very much the same, but the way that manifests itself it can look very different. And I think that's not exclusive to Christianity by any stretch of the imagination.
And I don't think you can fault one for seeing the world that way.
Right. Right.
Since we all do have personal needs, and sometimes they differ, but we have needs that may exceed at one point in our lives, and then resources that we have later, and where we have a surfeit of resources and are able to share those in some way. So it occurs to me to ask if these things that we're talking about are somehow in a hierarchy of our beliefs in these three traditions. Where does it fit? Are there lesser and more responsibilities within our faiths, or is this the real pinnacle of our traditions? This idea of somehow responding to the community in Raman's terms as if I am the other, and in some way I bear a commonality within the divine, and that gives that that idea, that thought or commitment makes me want to care for others around me the same as I wish to care for myself, which reminds me of the Christian commandment, that we should care for our neighbor as ourselves. And I know Jewish folks have a little different way of putting that, but what do you think about this hierarchy idea? Where does this fall in terms of our religious responsibilities?
I think it's I think it is a fact that the factor of our cultural and social experience affects any kind of answer. For 2,000 years or so, the Jewish community has been a minority, often oppressed, often finding itself in survival situations. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all to say that, well, because I'm saying it, the Jewish community would say we need to look after ourselves first. That if I am not for myself, who is going to be for me? There's a famous Hillel saying, if I am for myself, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, then what am I? So I think we all are part of circles that say, I need to protect what I have and who we are. And I guess I'm saying then what's left over can go other places. That's rather crass. But I think that's the reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right. I think when we think of how we have to live our lives practically, right? So that's true. That's why I think that's where the idea of theology and living life every moment kind of comes together, right? So I think the way we look at it is that ideally we shouldn't have to separate all of those things, like our faith experience and our living life in this world right now, right? So living life in this world is all of the things you mentioned: taking care of yourself, taking care of your family, your community, going to work even, right? Earning money, all of those things. I think what it is that, we are expected to devote some time to prayer and introspection and meditation, right? So time away from the world to do that, but that's not all your time. And when you're doing all of those other things that you're talking about, which is the majority of our lives, right? It's with that idea of keeping the divine in mind and in your thoughts as you're doing those things. So even when you're working or taking care of your family or your community, you're doing it with, I mean, in an ideal situation, you're doing it with the divine's presence, like really known to you, and then everything becomes a religious act if you do that. So even grocery shopping, right? If you're doing it thankfully and you're doing it to nourish yourself, and you're not over, indulging, and you're only buying what you need, then that's a religious act, right? That's a service act. But if you're right, it's where your mind, it's not really what your actions are, it's where your mind is more often. You can be in the church or the synagogue or the gurdwara and not be really there and not be doing anything religious also, right? So I guess that doesn't answer the question of hierarchy, but it answers how you marry that issue of how do I live practically in this world, right? I am still a human being, even though the divine is at play.
There's a paragraph in Deuteronomy that says you will love God, and then a few verses later, you will put these words on your hand or on your arm, and they will be for something, the Hebrew is unclear, between your eyes. The text says you will write these words on your arm, and they will be for something between your eyes. And I've always understand that. How do I love God? It's with everything I do, everything I reach for, and it's the lens through which I see the world. So whatever my actions and whatever comes into me and what comes out from me is done with that recognition that I'm supposed to love God, how you interpret love. I think that's what Raman is saying.
Yeah, I think, and I also hear what both of you saying a, as a way of shaping perspective on the world. And so I teach at a university that was founded by the Jesuits, and the Jesuits have the sayings that they love, one of which is the need to find God in all things. And so I think that's another way in which in the Christian tradition one thinks about that. But one of the things that I think they like to point out, quite rightly, is that when your perspective is shaped by a commitment to the divine or to finding God in all things, one can often be surprised where one finds the divine or God, and then what that calls one to do. And so it always puts me in mind of the parable of the sheep and goats in Matthew chapter 25, where you get when you've done it unto the least of these. But the issue is when the king comes back and asks the people if, how they've taken care of everyone, he says, look, you found the people that were thirsty and you gave them something to drink. You found the people that were hungry and you gave them something to eat. You found the people that were in need of clothing and you gave them clothing. And they thought of their responsibility as a responsibility to the king. But he says, no, when you've done it to them, you've done it to me. And so it's a way of shaping one's perspective on what it means to think about a commitment to God or the divine. If you widen that circle to think about where God shows up, where the divine shows up in as broad a frame of reference as one possibly can.
Yeah, so it puts me in mind of something that I often say, which is that in Christianity, the ethic is very hard to live up to. And that I'm reminded of the Jesus seminar, which uses, as I understand it, one way of evaluating the scriptures is that if it was really difficult to do, that's likely something Jesus actually said. That some of the other stuff the easier stuff, believers might have, added or embellished in some way. But if it's really difficult to do, love your enemies, for instance, the parable of the Good Samaritan. If you're really being asked to do something very difficult, then it's likely that's actually what Jesus was asking his followers to do. What do you think of that idea, Todd?
I think there's something to that, and so I'll frame it slightly different. One of the things I've always thought is that the famous anti-Christian Nietzsche got Christianity right, and in fact, that's why he says I can't be a Christian. I think part of why Nietzsche rejected Christianity is because he actually fundamentally understood it, and it didn't make any sense to him. But the part that didn't make any sense was he thought the ethic of one of the things that didn't make sense, the ethic of laying down one's own life in service for others, for example, he found to be, ridiculous on its face. And so in that sense, I think, maybe the Jesus seminar might be onto something. But one of the things I would say is when we talk about things being difficult, again, I think that calls us to really think about what that means. Like what constitutes something that's difficult? Because it always I'm reminded again, I'll use the text in Mark, where Jesus gets into it with a group of other religious leaders over the fact that some of his disciples have taken the wheat on the Sabbath and they have rubbed it between their fingers so that they could get the wheat and eat it. And this is understood by some as a violation. And what Jesus winds up saying, and I'm doing this, overly simplistic analysis, but what he winds up saying is, look, you have to rethink about what a commitment to God means. And a commitment to God can't be one such that it is defined in terms that actually diminish one's humanity. So those two things sort of stand in tension, this sort of ethic of laying down one's life on the one hand. On the other hand, there's an ethic which is about a flourishing humanity. And I think within the Christian tradition, those always stand somewhat in tension with each other. And they're not easily resolved.
So as we think about our own commitments to the divine other, to tikkun olam, repair of the world, to reaching out to all those in need that are given to us as a responsibility in the Sermon on the Mount. Is this really an impossible task? That we ought to be more maybe sympathetic to those who would want to look to themselves more than they are willing to look to those others in need.
I mean, I think judging anyone else is always problematic, right? So, because we all have our own story and our own journey, and we always think that we're doing the perfect amount of charity, or spending whatever we're doing is the right amount, right? And there's those that are giving more of themselves and those that are quote unquote more selfish than we are, right? So I think that all we can do is continue to perfect ourselves, right? We have such a short life in which to do this, that we, I was really moved by what Todd was talking about, well, I guess if I'm only here for a short time, I should be working on, and that's what our scripture actually says too. You're here for such a short time. This is your opportunity to connect with the divine. However, part of that connection is what we were talking about earlier. It's not just going into a cave and meditating. It's also, being in the world and trying to repair the world, So I think that that's the only obligation we have, is to continue to be our best and highest selves at all times, and at least not disappoint ourselves at the end of every day, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I also think there's a sense in which, to piggyback on that, and to answer your question, Bob, I think ethical ideals are always supposed to be slightly unattainable. If they were easily attained, then they cease to function in the way that they're supposed to function. So I think there's a sense in which, for all religious traditions and non-religious for that matter, that when you're thinking about ethical responsibilities, moral requirements, and so on and so forth, I think there's this interesting interplay between what is attainable and what isn't attainable, and how those two bounce back and forth off of each other. Because you don't want to always live in the unattainable. That becomes overwhelming and depressing. But the easily attainable ceases to motivate. And so there has to be a way in which you're trying to constantly bridge those two worlds.
Todd used the word tension before. It seems to me that if your faith commitment is not in tension, in some kind of tension with energy, then what good is it?
Mm-hmm.
If all your faith does is make you feel good about yourself,
right?
What good is that to anybody else?
Right.
And why would a benevolent divine presence want that to be the end point of the faith commitment, that I feel good about myself? Of what use is that to anybody else?
I like that. I'm sure that that will be something that we'll get others to talk about too. What good is that to just have your faith make you feel good about yourself? And of course, there's aspects of faith that affect our social location, right? There's been times, I think, in our religious history when you could pretty much identify what your social location would be by what faith group you were participating in. And so I think that the way you all responded to that will be an interesting thing to encourage people who listen to this to talk about. I'm wondering if Raman, if you would spend just a minute or two again to talk about something that's a requirement from all of our faiths, and I think it's been made clear by some of the discussion already, that we're supposed to actually act out our faith in some way, that it's not something that we just carry around for ourselves, what I would call pietism, just something that serves us, as we were just saying. But one thing that I'm thinking about is the languor, the requirement for languor in the Sikh faith. Would you say something about that, Raman? And I'm sure there's much more than I know that has theological value in it.
Right. So this is an example of something that is a practical, like living out of the faith, and it's not necessarily clearly spelled out in our scripture, right? It's something that evolved. So I really think that the Sikhs always look at things as kind of this both external and internal journey at all times, right? We have this internal connection we have to build with the divine, recognize the divine within us and within others, within the entire creation, at the same time living that out in a practical sense. So one of the ways is this community meal at all of our gurdwaras called langar. And langar has like kind of so many multifaceted aspects of what it symbolizes for participants and people who get to eat it and people who get to prepare it. So for those who don't know, it's a community meal that anytime you go to a gurdwara, you're supposed to be able to be fed, whether or not there's a service going on. But if you arrive at a gurdwara that's open, you should be able to get something to eat and something to and a place to rest if you need that or something like that. So the way we sort of institutionalize that is that at least at the end of every service, you're going to have a langar meal. And that we all sit together, we eat the same food. And so for us, it symbolizes, number one, equality, right? So when langar was established 500 years ago, everybody had to eat the same food. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, right? But at that time in India, there were caste differences, and people weren't allowed to sit together and always eat the same food together. Like you had to know who was sitting next to you. And if that person wasn't acceptable, you may not, you wouldn't want them there. And, but I guess we can even relate to that because 70 or 80 years ago in this country, we all couldn't sit together in the same restaurants and eat, right? Depending on what color you were or where you were from. But so it represents equality. It also represents service. So, because no matter who comes into the gurdwara, you serve them, right? So you don't know if they're your enemy or how they voted or, or anything about them. So you serve them. And it also represents the blessing of being together, right? The idea. So for us, again, we have this individual practice, but we also have when we come together in, congregation, we call it sangat. So we're together, we get to partake of a meal together. And we all sit at the same level. So we don't have special chairs for the VIPs. We have special chairs for those who can't sit on the floor, but we don't have special chairs if you are if you're a more important person or anything like that. And again, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but hundreds of years ago, that's how it was. Kings might get a special location, but when the king, the first time, that he came in the 1500s, when a king arrived at a Sikh gurdwara to meet with the guru who was living at that time, we didn't have a scripture, he was required to sit with everybody else in the langar to eat. And that, caused such a stir. So it's a reminder of many things, that I serve others, I serve them without regard to who they are, that everybody eats the same food, everybody sits together. So it's this like service, equality, oneness symbolized in front of me. That is oneness, right? When like I'm going to, without regard to who's in front of me, I'm going to take care of them.
I know that the first time I experienced a langar meal, I was really impressed with it. There's something humbling about it to sit on the floor and be served, and at the same time to feel like, well, maybe I should be serving. And so you need to sort of put that aside and accept service, which for some of us is difficult to do. I know it felt that way for me. And I'm also aware that when we send our 12-year-olds to a Gurdwara and they experience the longer meal, they walk away really impressed, kind of flabbergasted. Like I went to a religious service that somehow the point of it was that they served me. And for me, I walk away and say, well, we have something that puts me in mind of that. It's not exactly the same thing, but we have the communion in our, Christian churches. And yet, as I've learned through interfaith work quite often, the idea that another faith has for communal feeding, in this case, deepens my own desire to deepen my understanding of my own faith and to maybe do something more in terms of my own faith to serve, to make it clear that it isn't just a perfunctory act, that I watch all the preparation going on in a Gurdwara kitchen and I realize, wow, there's a lot of people putting a lot of time into preparing this. And of course, somebody had to bring all those resources into the kitchen and so on. And it just deepens my understanding of what service should be. It's not just, well, you ought to take care of other people, but it's here, take care of other people in this way. How does that affect or impress either of you, Todd or Joe?
Go ahead, Todd. I need to think about that.
Well, I mean, as you were talking, Raman, I was thinking about the way meals and food are in religions the world over are places where ethical and social commitments play out and where you can easily see them not playing out. So as you were talking about that, I was immediately thinking about the Apostle Paul in the first letter he writes to the Christian community at Corinth, 1 Corinthians in the New Testament. This community is a mess, but one of the things he takes them to task for in this letter is that they are not observing the meal practices that define the early Christian community. One of the things that they're doing is that the wealthy people are arriving first with very good food, eating it all and leaving before the poor people show up, who are also part of the Christian community. And he says to them in the letter, what is wrong with you? Have you like lost the entire point of this? And so it was a reminder that, yeah, the similar practices I think are found the world over, but they can come off the rails. And when they come off the rails, it can often be indicative of deeper, more serious ethical and moral problems within the community, where people are not living up to the commitment that they ought to have to one another. So maybe they're not getting, it could be a very small thing that they're not getting the bowl of green beans because, they're getting eaten before they get down to them. But that can often be symptomatic of bigger issues in the communities, right? So it's not just about, I don't want to give, my friend here the bowl of green beans. That's probably saying something else about how I'm not living up to my moral and ethical commitment. So there's a kind of underside to that it always reminds me of. But I think meal practices are such an important part of the spiritual life of faith communities, but it's a spiritual practice that has this ethical and moral undertone to it.
Yeah, I think that's a very cultural and social truth.
Mm-hmm.
Sitting down and eating together forms a bond. To my knowledge, it's not institutionalized within the Jewish community the way it is in the Sikh community. I do like that. The meal is always important. The meal is a moment of giving thanks for what we have, both what we have this way and what we have this way. It's just not as institutionalized as communion was in its beginning. as Paul was talking about in Corinthians, or currently in the Sikh community?
Well, I think I have, a couple more ideas that I'd like to explore, and one of them is the idea of power. We talked a little bit about that before we began the podcast. And Todd, this was an idea that you wanted to make sure we thought about a little bit. So I want to ask you to expand on that a little bit. What about the issues of power and care?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you contacted us about this with the idea of care for others, those are not neutral terms. And what constitutes care and who gets defined as other is always those things are always defined within a nexus of power relationships. Who has the power to actually care in what that means? Who has the power to determine who or what constitutes the other? Who gets to make that call? Maybe I don't want to be known as the other, but am I in a position to say I'm not? Or maybe I don't want someone to put a responsibility of care on me, but if that's where I sit in the kind of social dynamic, then there are all those things. So I think it's impossible to divorce this notion of caring for others from the way in which we actually think about the exercise of power in a social context. And so I'm not talking about power politically, although one could talk about that if you wanted to. But this can be something as small and simple as in a home or in a faith community at the meal, that we were just talking about. What does that play like? You were using the word equality or equal. That's one way of thinking about power. But once that you start looking at inequalities in those dynamics, then what does it look like to care for the other? And so I wanted to put that on the table as a topic for discussion because I think it's important to realize that we don't all, and I think Joe gestured toward this earlier, we don't all stand or sit in the same social location, and that makes the responsibility different depending on where we're sitting, and it defines for us what it means to care for the other differently. To come back to what I was saying earlier, when I was that kid in Appalachian, Kentucky, I didn't have the power to go out and care for others. I was in self-preservation mode in those days. But now my responsibility would be quite different. And so there's a way in which I think we have to think about what that looks like, and then what the responsibility then becomes, to use the oft-used phrase, to whom much is given, much is required. But what does that actually look like to use the word that we've used several times? What does that look like practically? And how do we actually have to do that? So I said a lot there without saying much, but I just wanted us to make sure that sometimes I think this gets defined so individualistically that there's a way in which we don't understand we all exist in this kind of nexus of social power and what that looks like. And that helps us see our communal responsibility more broadly.
There's an irony in all of this, in that those with power are the ones most able to provide comprehensive help. And those with power are the most likely to say, I have it, you don't,
right? Too
bad.
Right.
So there's this delicious irony in all of this, but you're absolutely right about it. We can't talk about helping the other without also understanding the place that power in so many ways, has to do with that.
That is the danger, right? As far as caring for others or doing charity or doing the right thing, are we comfortable with the idea of, instead of just giving a little bit, why don't you just take most of my money and stuff and give it away? Really? Because I don't need 80% of the stuff I have, right? Or the money I have, really. Or why is it okay with me that some people have to subsist or exist with so much less than me, and I'm, so those are really hard kind of things to live with. But I think that you're right. In a power dynamic, I think we enjoy that sort of place of power, that, oh, look at me, I'm able to give, and because it's such a privilege, right? And it is a position of individual power, and it can be then, like you said, a collective power too. So there's this collective overclass that likes to keep an underclass to some extent. I'm not trying to be, political, but like there was some thought behind this idea that everybody should just be the same, right? And just have enough to live comfortably, but not excessively. But then who gets to define what's excessive, right? That's a power game too. So yeah, it's tough. That can get depressing if you start to think about it too much, because then how will you live day to day with everything you have, right?
Yeah. And I think on a a broader scale, there is this sense in which those with power have to think about the need or the necessity of relinquishing some. So when we think about religion, one of the conversations we've been having in some parts of the university is, how do you make space for those whose religious or faith traditions are different from your own? And that conversation is really directed at Christians in the place, because they occupy the vast majority of the space. So how do you give up some of that space, which is a move of power? How do you give up that space to make space for others who can meaningfully participate in spiritual life of the collective whole, and so on and so forth? And so that's just another way I think about that, in thinking about. And oddly enough, I find, I spend my days most of the time with 18 to 23 or 24-year-olds. This generation has much less difficulty with that than mine or ours. They're much more inclusive, I think, in those ways. Even those that come from places of power. So I think that's one thing we've done right by with this younger generation. They've somehow figured that out, despite our best efforts to not live up to our ideals.
That's a really good question. You said, like, about this, how do you make space, right?
Yeah.
I think that it is difficult to relinquish power. I was having a conversation with some officials from a school district, and they were saying, we're having difficulty trying to be inclusive about recognizing all these faith tradition holidays, right? Because there's just simply not enough school days in the year. Like, we would be off every day if we had to. I said, well, are you? I mean, I was only joking, but I said, are you willing to give up those last 2 weeks in December because you have them off for one religious holiday? You're taking 2 weeks. And I mean, I was literal. It's a joke, but it really does tell you, right? That where the power.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So I think you've alluded to this, to part of the answer to this question, Todd, because your social location, as you mentioned before, what your current circumstances are, to some degree will govern what you have to offer and whom you can care for beyond yourself. And you suggested that at a certain time in your life, you were in survival mode, and that would have certain kinds of requirements that later on you might be released from because of the social location you attain later. So is there anything we could generally say about what gets you off the hook from these responsibilities? When is it that you can say that's too much? It's asking too much of me to even pay for that, to pay for a government that would want to care for others in some way, to give up your time, to feed others, and to care for them, to take them into your holy space or into your home. Any thoughts on that? Is there, where do we where do we find ourselves in that continuum, and how do we make some judgments?
I would not like my faith community to offer a blanket pass.
Mm-hmm.
I would reject that.
Mm-hmm.
We all have a responsibility to do what we can do.
Right. Right.
I want to go back to what that Hillel statement I said before. If I am not for myself, who will be? If I am only for myself,
Mm-hmm.
what am I? And then the final statement, by the way, is if not now, when?
Mm-hmm.
So I would not like my community to give a blanket pass to somebody who is in dire straits. You know, there is always something we can do to make this a better world for others. Some people, folks beyond my personal world or my personal circle.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And I wouldn't want what I said earlier to be misconstrued or misunderstood, because I don't think what I was saying earlier, I didn't mean that to stand in contradiction to that. I agree with you entirely. I think it's a matter of how you define who your responsibility is to and what that looks like. But we all have a responsibility on us to do what we can in the moment. And sometimes that's a little, and sometimes that's a lot. But there's always that responsibility. So I don't know, to pick up your question, Bob, I don't know that I would be in favor of giving a blanket pass either to any members of the community, of the Christian community or any community.
And that brings us back to the notion of tension.
Yeah, right. I think it's a matter of just what that, to use the verb we've used in this, what the care looks like and who that cares to. Although we're talking about care of the other, as Joe has pointed out, sometimes the care is care to self. And if we see ourselves all as connected, as all part of the divine, those are not, the individuation is not such that we are completely separate from one another. There is a way in which care for the self can be care for the other. I think of the story of Ruth in the Hebrew Bible. Ruth and Naomi they're taking care of themselves, but it winds up caring for the community. Their act of self-preservation winds up, redounding to the bigger, broader community.
Absolutely. I think the key again, though, is that we are challenging ourselves to continue to do the work and not necessarily judging others, because we don't know where they are, right? As far as mentally, physically, financially, we have no idea, right? Psychologically, where anybody is and what capability they have. But we do know that we should be maximizing our service to others, right? Or not others, or unothering others, I guess, is what we should be doing.
And should we be encouraging, or somehow even use maybe some stronger word, the governance of our society, the powers that be, to take on this responsibility also? And to what degree?
Do we insist on it from our religious perspective or from a social perspective?
Go ahead and say what you think the difference might be.
Well, there's a difference in authenticity and authority, I suppose. I don't have a problem in saying that from my religious perspective, we need to preserve the welfare system. I don't have a problem saying that. Now, somebody else may not like it, saying you can't mix state and faith, or state and religion, right? Church and state, we can't mix it. So no, you can't say it from your religious perspective. I don't have a problem. That's part of who I am. So I think it's okay. Maybe it's not okay to insist on it only because, my religion tells me that I need to do it.
Yeah, I think it gets back to personal responsibility, right? So
Yes.
how we vote, what policies we support, if they don't align with, again, back to that practical, if they don't align with our faith tradition, then what good are they, right? So, but what decisions we make, whether we are writing legislatures or we're voting a certain way or we're marching in the street, I mean, these are going to be personal decisions on how that plays out, but it still has to align. I mean, I think what you said was really important. Joe, as far as, because I did a lot of thinking about this when they talked about like universal, healthcare. And I don't want to, again, make a, political statement, but I was realizing that because we were talking about Canadian healthcare. So Canadian healthcare, like for each individual person is maybe less than the wonderful healthcare that I get here because I happen to have good insurance, right? But everybody has that sort of mediocre healthcare there, and nobody has none, right? And so I think that's like a soul searching we would have to do. Are we okay with having a little less so everybody can have some, And that's a personal decision that I can't judge anybody else about, but I have to kind of go through that that philosophical kind of journey, right?
Right.
And I think it's okay to be public in saying, my faith community tells me that this is true. That it's important to know where people are coming from. You don't have to agree with me, but we shouldn't be hiding the values that are within our community.
Yeah, in my case, I hold in high regard. I hope our listeners are all aware of this idea of the nuns on the bus. These faithful religious women who have taken vows to work for the good and to teach and so on in our communities, who for a while were on a charter bus going from community to community to talk about the idea of the requirement that we live out the Matthew, Sermon on the Mount and care for others, as we've been talking about it here. And I have such great respect for that idea that there are people within my Catholic faith who are really making that a primary concern, so that and asking the government to respond in some way by having access to collective resources and therefore having much more power, as we were talking about earlier, to affect the care for others in one way or another who are in need. Seems to me that it's a very salient part of the gospel that I understand in the way that I understand it. One thing that I think that I'd like to leave our listeners with is maybe just this may seem like a little bit of a surprising question, but I have thought about it. The idea that maybe my faith offers something that I don't hear strongly put forth in other faiths. And so I'm wondering if there's something in the realm of this idea of how we care for others, whether it is charity or a commandment, the way we put it initially. Is there something that you would like that you think is emphasized in your faith tradition that others should be more aware of and that might serve others if they knew a little bit about it? I'll throw out something just as my own suggestion, that I often say that the fact that there's a very strong idea of judgment in the Christian faith, that people ought to be thinking about judgments, whether or not they want to put it at their end of their lives or at the second coming or whatever that Christian concept might be, but that there ought to be some thought about, how do I judge myself for how well I'm doing, how well I'm living this faith? And so I find that some people might say, well, the judgment thing is just too strong in Christianity, and I don't quite get it. But for me, it's a value that I think is important. And so, if I would put that out there as something that I see in my faith that I think others might give a second thought to. Do any of you have a thought within your faith that you think others might want to take a special note of?
In the Jewish community and its heritage, there is this notion that what brings you into covenant with God and what keeps you in covenant with God is how you behave. That covenant is not determined by proper faith or belief, It is determined by proper behavior. And long ago, rabbinic commentator said, if you behave rightly, if you behave properly, justly, then your belief will follow. Then belief in God and faith in the heritage will follow. So the priority is how you behave. So at the end of each day, coming all the way back to the beginning of what we started with, if at the end of each day I can look at myself in the mirror and say, I may not have done a whole lot today to save the world, but I did something that made it a better place for others and humanity and others in my community. And at that moment is the recognition God is happy with you.
I'll say that I think that the thing that we're reminded at all times is that we're really lucky to have this human life, right? Because the human life is the only one that gets to think about these things, but is also the one challenged with choices, right? All other forms of life live out by instinct, right? So, but they don't make mistakes then either. They do exactly what the divine wants them to do. We unfortunately and unfortunately get to choose whether we're going to do what's divine or not divine, right? Whether we're going to turn our face away from God or towards God is how we put it, gurmukh and manmukh. Are we going to follow our mind or follow God? So I think that's what we get to think about each day. And as we get older, we realize we have less of that time left to kind of get that divine realization. So we ought to be putting more energy and time towards it at all times.
I mean, what I was thinking is similar to that, and that is the idea that the having ethical and moral responsibility is a privilege of being a human being, and acting morally and ethically is done as an act of thanksgiving. Because as you put it, non-human actors don't have the possibility of doing that. It's done, and that's part of the Christian tradition that comes out of the Jewish tradition. But I think that gets picked up, even by people like Augustine and others, that it's a privilege, and that behaving that way is an act of thanksgiving. And I think that can help reframe one's perspective about moral and ethical requirement when you think about it that way.
Well, I think that this is an amazingly meaty discussion that we've had today, and I am immensely grateful. I think that this isn't really, we could go on, but I think this is also a good time to say that we've put some ideas out there that are worth thinking about. Especially right now. How do we do seva? How do we do care for others, live out the Sermon on the Mount? How do we repair the world? And this is a time when I think people may have gotten a little bit too mired in their own individual worries and complaints, and are maybe by that encouraged to not think about the needs of others. And it may be actually the problem in the first place, that people feel that they are themselves not being cared for, and therefore they are willing to say that others are not going to get what they need until I get what I need. And so that may be where we're at in society in some ways right now. And what we've offered is a way out of that, as long as people are willing to be self-critical a little bit, and to think about the problem in the terms that you all have directed us to think about them today. So I thank you, as I said, immensely grateful that you've taken an hour of your time to help put this thought out there. And I'm pretty certain that we're going to get a discussion going among more than just our own circle of people that know us. So we'll put this out beyond that and get this discussion moving. It's certainly a time when it's needed. And if we can go to bed tonight thinking that we've done a little bit to bring that thought to others, we may have done a little to repair the world. So I'm hopeful anyway. And to our listeners, I want to say you've been listening to a conversation about the idea of care for the other, charity, or commandment. We wanted to offer some thoughts from our traditions on the answer to that question. And we invite you to think about it and to send any thoughts you have to us at the InterFaith Leadership Council. You can send those to faithandworkspodcast@gmail.com. You may have heard at the beginning and some music at the end that is granted to us, a license to use it, by bensound.com. And so we appreciate the fact that Ben Sound has given us that music to use in our podcast. More information on the InterFaith Leadership Council of Metropolitan Detroit can be gotten at DetroitInterfaithCouncil.com. We welcome your comments. Thank you very much. And we hope that you'll listen to this and our future podcasts on this question of how our traditions require us to care for others. So thank you.
And like and subscribe the podcast to Faith and Works.
Thank you. Good reminder, like and subscribe to our podcast, Faith and Works.
Lovely.
Bye-bye now.